For anyone who has experienced a natural disaster, it can be a long road recovering from it. Imagine enduring that natural disaster and finding a new place for your family to live, only to be tormented by something you can't see for the next 15 years. This was the case for a small town family in the eastern United States who battled not only a demonic entity, but a harem of ghosts and mischievous spirits. The story would draw international attention and would require the assistance of two famous demonologists to remedy it. This story is coming up in this week's episode. Stay with us. Hello everyone, and welcome back for another chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. As always, I'm your host Nick, and on this week's episode, we're going to tell the story of the Smurl family, a small-town Pennsylvania family that endured torment at the hands of a violent demonic entity and other spirits for 15 years. Ensure you're subscribed to this podcast so you don't miss out on any of the weekly episodes. Now, it's time to turn out your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen for a moment. Maybe you're alone, but maybe you're not. Now, follow the sound of my voice, and let's get into our story. Our story begins with Jack and Janet Smurl, two of the central characters to our episode. Both Jack and Janet had grown up in the town of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. They met one another in 1967, and after a short time together, they would marry in 1968. Both Jack and Janet were Catholic, and this was a big part of their family life. Jack had also served in the United States Navy. In the year 1972, the eastern seaboard of the United States, along with parts of the Caribbean and Canada, felt the effects of Hurricane Agnes. Agnes was the first named hurricane of the 1972 season and hit extremely hard. The hurricane claimed 128 human lives and cost approximately $2.1 billion of damage. Needless to say, by this point in history, Agnes had been the most costly hurricane. Out of all the places the hurricane affected, the state of Pennsylvania was hit extremely hard. Some parts of the state were hit with around 180 millimeters of rain, while others up to 480. The resulting damage would cause a large number of families in the state to be displaced due to flooding. One of these families that was forced to evacuate and move is the subject of this episode. Jack and Janet Smurl, with their 4 daughters, Heather, Dawn, Karen, and Shannon, and their German Shepherd Simon, were forced to leave their home and find somewhere new to live. They eventually found a new home, a duplex that was described as a bit of a fixer-upper, and they purchased it for the sum of only $18,000. The home was located at 328 Chase Street in West Pittston. The Smurl family moved into one side of the duplex in August of 1943. On their other side were Jack's parents, John and Mary. The first 18 months living in the duplex, the family would experience nothing really out of the ordinary. Life went on, the family picking up the pieces and recovering from the hurricane that forced them out of their previous home. The Smurl family were practicing Catholics and avid churchgoers. They were considered pillars of their community. Shortly after moving in, Jack and Janet had begun to renovate their new home. They would replace the flooring, paint the walls, just largely doing things that would make their home a bit cozier. Then, at first, there were small disturbances that seemed a bit out of the ordinary, but nothing malicious. Tools would go missing here and there, and stains on the walls would seep through the new coats of paint. Other small occurrences would begin to present as well. Toilets would flush on their own, and small electrical appliances would seemingly lose power, although there was no discernible explanation for the cause. Jack and Janet would attribute this to possible plumbing or electrical issues, considering by that point that their home was about 100 years of age when they moved in. Unfortunately for the family, things would begin to take a much darker turn beginning in January of 1974. During the night of one of their daughter's confirmations into the Catholic Church, they almost immediately began to feel a shift of energy in their home. A feeling of darkness began to set in and overtake the home. The first real instance of a true haunting was when the ceiling fan in their living room began to shake violently and then dropped for no apparent reason, almost striking their daughter Shannon in the process. This was very confusing to the family, as the fan was bolted into the beams of the home that ran through the kitchen, so it was securely fastened in. Appliances that were not plugged in seemingly began to burst into flames with no electrical connections present. Even the family television would fall victim to some kind of spontaneous combustion. From these events, the entity that plagued the Smurl family would begin to make itself known. The entity began to knock on the doors and walls of the home, usually in patterns of 3. The symbolism for this is that it was a common demonic mockery of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Accompanying the rapping in the home also came a strong odor that would twist its way through the walls at random hours. When it came, it was inescapable and would make members of the family nauseous, a smell they would describe akin to rotting flesh. Again, being an older home, the phenomena could have possibly been explained away by the home settling, or perhaps there was simply a dead animal somewhere. The initial phenomena, more strange than malicious, began to take a toll on the entire family in more ways than just disrupting their home. Jack's mother, Mary, would suffer a heart attack shortly after the hauntings began. The family would unfortunately struggle to pay her hospital bills for the next few years. The phenomena would begin increasing in its intensity to the point of ghost sightings and different manifestations occurring. Claw marks would be scratched into the walls of their home. Shadow figures and apparitions would materialize out of thin air, sometimes even coming through the walls and the ceiling. The Smurl's daughter, Dawn, recalled lying in her bed on multiple occasions and could see shadowy figures on the ceiling above her bed while she tried to sleep. For the next 12 years, the Smurl family would endure the horrible hauntings to come. There were absolutely terrifying things that happened to the family during this time that they have made public. But, like many other famous cases, such as the Perrin family haunting on Round Top Road, that it could be believed that there are stories so horrific that they'll never be told again. One of the darkest things to have happened to the family was with respect to the way the entity presented itself. It communicated with the family through the sounds of moans and blood-curdling screams that would reverberate through the walls at all hours of the day and night. To add an absolute scare factor to this, sometimes the entity would take on the voices of the members of the family, luring them around the house to where it waited for them. Janet recalled being in the basement one day, doing a load of laundry, when she heard her mother-in-law's voice call out to her from upstairs. When she went to investigate, there was no one around. The sounds of this entity became so loud the screams could be heard by the Smurls' neighbors when none of the family were home. Floating black creatures and more shadow people began to manifest themselves. In later investigation, it was reported that a mucus-like, smoky substance would appear on the mirrors of the home. It would spell out obscenities and would order any investigators or people who had come to help out of the house. Other things that happened of note during this period was the removal of objects from walls. One of the fixtures was even thrown at one of the Smurl's children, cutting her quite deeply. Jack reported that on one occasion he was praying the rosary before going to sleep when the entity ripped him from his bed. Family members would report being levitated with no apparent explanation why. Even the family dog Simon was picked up by the entity and slammed against a wall. Janet suffered through an event where she was picked up by the creature and thrown across the living room. Jack claimed to have been bitten in the face by the entity and watched it throw one of his daughters down the stairs. Janet, while in the kitchen one evening, felt the room grow extremely cold and could feel a hideous presence all around her. When she turned around, she saw a black, human-shaped form before her. It had no face and appeared more physical than ethereal. The shape looked at her and then turned and walked through the wall of the kitchen to the other side of the duplex, where it was seen by Mary. After enduring many years of torture at the hands of this entity, came the event that is probably the most chilling and synonymous with this haunting. The entity's mission was to tear the Smurl family apart, though it had happened on occasions before. The final straw was when Jack and Janet were sexually assaulted by this entity. For Janet had awoken one evening to an unknown figure assaulting her. And Jack would claim that while watching a baseball game in their living room, that he was assaulted the exact same way by what he believed to be a succubus. The succubus he described as a scaly entity of an old woman that appeared to him as a beautiful young woman with red eyes and green gums. Jack believed that this was the same presence that tore him from his bed while he was in prayer. Some of the happenings during this period of the haunting could appear to skeptics as a result of domestic violence. It's entirely possible that domestic violence really was the perpetrator and that the Smurl family were in a really rocky marriage, using a clever ghost story to cover up injuries and shouting matches. But it's important to note that no incidents involving domestic abuse in this case have ever been proven. By this point, the Smurl family have been enduring torture at the hands of this malicious entity for 12 years. They would finally relent and seek help. Being the highly religious people that they were, they turned to the Catholic Church. They wanted to inquire into the possibility of having an exorcism performed to rid the home of whatever was ailing it. The Catholic Church refused their request. Being desperate and not receiving the kind of help they were seeking, the family had no choice but to go public with their story. They would appear on a TV program out of Philadelphia called People Are Talking. They did so in anonymity, remaining behind a curtain while they were interviewed by Richard Bay. Remaining anonymous did nothing to draw helping hands to their cause and only infuriated the entity terrorizing them. It began to repeatedly attack Janet, picking her up and throwing her against the wall. The succubus returned to sexually assault Jack again, and one night, while Janet was sleeping in her bed, the entity reached up from underneath, through the mattress, and grabbed her throat. Jack and Janet couldn't continue to take this abuse any longer. Enough was enough. They had decided that the public ridicule would outweigh the suffering. They were able to get an interview to get their story in the Wilkes-Barre Sunday Independent newspaper. Their story in that paper would begin a non-stop parade of media and curious community members coming to their home. People had begun to show up on the doorstep wanting to interview the family and gain a closer look, if they could, at the terrifying things that were being said by the Smurls. The Smurls' property got so busy that even their street became jammed with cars to the point that their neighbors were unable to get out of their driveways. One of their neighbors, a man by the name of Bill Watson, recalled waking up one morning to a camera crew from Germany in his driveway. The story at this point was garnering international attention. Unfortunately for the family, this would draw more attention to them from the entity, with Janet expressing discomfort with all the attention and publicity and stated that the demon didn't like it. Their story would also garner negative attention from some of the public. Those people would believe that the family was perpetrating a hoax and that none of what they were saying was real at all. They would vandalize the Smurls' home, throwing bricks and rocks through their windows. Karen Smurl would later recount that during this period, her father worked to protect the family from onlookers and naysayers. She would say that he was scared too, but he was always the tough one. It even got so bad that at one point she recalled her father and grandfather sitting on the front porch with rifles. She would find comfort in the fact that they did everything they could to protect the rest of the family. The media attention would also soon reach the ears of a famous couple from Monroe, Connecticut, paranormal investigators and demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. At this point, the Warrens already had a high profile in that community, having been involved with the famous hauntings such as the Amityville Horror and the Enfield Poltergeist, that they decided to visit the Smurl family after a call from Jack and Janet arriving in the summer of 1986. The Warrens' first order of business was to investigate and question the Smurls themselves. They would ask them whether or not the family had used Ouija boards or held seances in their home in order to determine if they invited something in through any occult practices. The family refuted that question and began to explain that the phenomena had begun to appear after the religious ceremony of their daughter. The Warrens would go on to conduct an extensive investigation on the home, where it was discovered that not one but 4 evil spirits were haunting the family and the home. 3 of those spirits were believed to be benevolent and mischievous at a minimum. The 4th was determined to be extremely bad and dangerously violent. Ed would laud the believed demonic entity for being very powerful. During their investigation, the demonic presence would shake mirrors and furniture, attempting to drive off the Warrens. Ed and Lorraine, in turn, would play religious music and pray, attempting to save ritual and drive the demon out with simpler means. the demon would interrupt the prayer and song, screeching, "You filthy bastard, get out of this house." Then the house began to shake, and two female ghosts appeared that were dressed in colonial-era attire. They began to move around, although nothing seemed amiss. This was the only time that ghosts from that era would be recorded, but it's believed that one of the two may have been the succubus that assaulted Jack. From his first night in the home, Ed recounted that he did not have to wait long to experience the demonic activity for himself. He experienced a temperature drop that he believed to be around 30 degrees, and a dark mass would appear in front of him. In the presence of Ed and Lorraine, the demon began to become violent. It would throw things around the home, most notably the mattress in the master bedroom. For Lorraine's part, as the clairvoyant, she began to walk through the home and experienced a very dark energy. She knew that what the family was experiencing was sheer terror. The Warrens were undeterred by the entity's presence, even when they were being told to leave. For Ed and Lorraine certainly believed that the haunting was genuine. Ed even claimed to have had a number of recordings of the demon knocking on the walls, but to this day, none have ever been believed to have been released. The Warrens' investigation would last a number of months before reaching a conclusion. In the end, Lorraine was able to discern that the first spirit was that of an elderly woman who wasn't malicious and mainly kept to herself. The second was an older gentleman whom had died in the home in years previous. The third was the ghost of a young woman, and the fourth was a demon who was able to control the other entities of the home. With that being said, there were also many skeptics of this situation. A professor at the State University of New York by the name of Paul Kurtz was not convinced by the authenticity of the situation. He believed, as most had come to criticize the Warrens, that they weren't objective investigators and certainly weren't independent or impartial. He characterized the situation as a hoax and a charade, a make-believe ghost story. Kurtz would believe that the family's problems stemmed from delusions or hallucinations caused by brain impairment. He was quite adamant that the family should submit themselves for psychiatric and psychological examinations. Finally, the Catholic Church would also see fit to intervene. Spokespersons from the Diocese of Scranton were unsure what would be causing all the disturbances. A theology professor from St. Bonaventure University named Alphonsus Trebold believed that there may be a less demonic explanation for the happenings on the Smurl family's home. Trebold was both an expert in exorcism practice and the paranormal. He visited the family home, and while there, he was able to say that he believed the family to be sincere, but didn't believe that their affliction was demonic. Ed and Lorraine would next bring in a priest from their parish in Monroe by the name of Robert McKenna, who was of the Our Lady of the Rosary Chapel, and commissioned him to perform 3 exorcisms on the home. The first 2 were unsuccessful, and the family experienced the same dark energy as they had before. Their home even received a Catholic blessing, and even that did not help to remove the dark spirits. Other priests who had come to do blessings on multiple occasions would attest that during their time there, they had experienced no harmful activity on the property. Janet would later claim that this was because the demons were able to avoid Catholic banishment by moving back and forth between both sides of the duplex. The third exorcism would finally be the one that would banish the spirits from the home in September of 1986. The Smurl family was free of torment for about 2 months, but unfortunately in December, everything returned. Shortly before Christmas, the black, violent apparition would appear before Jack, begging him to let it in order to possess his body. Jack hoped to drive it away with his rosary and prayer, which, like many times before, was entirely unsuccessful, and soon the banging and physical torments came back. The Smurls were distraught, but would continue on, lingering, living in the home. The non-stop parade of people outside their home was unrelenting. The Smurls and the Warrens would finally tell the press that they were tired of the constant media bombardment. With that being said, only a few months later, the Smurls, along with the Warrens and local columnist Robert Curran, would release a paperback version of the story they called The Haunting. Robert Curran would come under fire from others in his vocation for being a part of what was labeled a one-sided account of the events. The book itself, which was published by St. Martin's Press, was also criticized for being very poorly written. Along with this, Jack had negotiated with a Hollywood company to sell the rights to their story for a 2-hour movie that was released direct to TV in 1991. Among the credited writers for that story were Jack, Janet, and the Warrens. After the Warrens finally left the family home, the Smurl family would enlist the help of a local psychic medium named Mary Alice Rinkman. Rinkman would conduct her own investigation and produced roughly the same information as Lorraine. She would state that the first spirit that was of the old woman was named Abigail. The second was described as a dark, mustached man named Patrick, who had once murdered his wife and lover and then was put to death himself by a mob. The third identity she could not truly discern, but was able to confirm that the fourth truly was a violent, powerful demon that controlled the other spirits. The Smurls wanted to move away from the home when the phenomenon returned, but were financially unable to. They relied heavily on the power of prayer to get them through those next 2 years. They would be joined in a series of intense prayers by Reverend Joseph Adonizio, who felt that things had finally returned to normal in the home. By 1987, Janet Smurl had reported that the family still heard knocking throughout the home and saw shadow figures, but that the violent acts had not returned. In 1988, the Smurls would finally be able to leave their home, moving back to Wilkes-Barre. A fourth exorcism was performed on the home, which seemed to finally banish the demon for good. After moving out, Karen Smurl would say that the family had finally put the events behind them. Jack began working at Tops Chewing Gum and began to be more involved with his family and community. He served with the West Pittston Lions Club and became more involved in their church. The daughters would all go on to do well in school and even become involved with sports. Karen and Shannon would go on to become all-star athletes and play on the Wilkes University basketball team. After the family sold the home, it was bought by a woman named Deborah Owens. Deborah told reporters that she had never experienced anything of a supernatural nature while living there. Jack would pass away in 2017 from diabetes-related complications and held that the story of the haunting was genuine all the way up until his death. Karen went on to work in the entertainment industry and assists in paranormal investigations in her spare time. She does this because she's inspired by the events that happened in her childhood home, and she wants nothing more than to help people that are experiencing what her family went through. With the story of the Smurl family coming to a close, were they truly haunted by a violent demon and its legion of spirits? Or Was this something the family created in order to generate attention that eventually led to a book and a movie deal? Let's examine some of the evidence. The family first began experiencing an increase in paranormal phenomena that targeted them directly in 1974. 3 years later, in 1977, a literary icon of a book was released known as the Amityville Horror, which would spawn a movie of the same name 2 years later. Also, coincidentally, at the forefront of the Amityville investigation were our demonologists, Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Amityville case was what truly vaulted the Warrens into stardom and the eyes of the world, as details of that haunting began broadcast internationally. With this in mind, after being haunted for nearly 5 years at that point, if Jack and Janet really just wanted to get a piece of the action and get themselves in the Hollywood spotlight, why wouldn't they have just come forward then? What did they gain waiting and enduring torment for another 7 years when you could just have your 15 minutes of fame? This can really go in 2 different directions. The first was when they finally broke their story to the media. They didn't relish the attention they received, at one point even waiting on their front porch armed with rifles. Towards the end of it all, the Smurls even came forward and asked everyone to leave. If the money and the fame were so important to them, why wouldn't they have just chased it years earlier? Understanding as well that they jumped for the chance to sign on a book and movie towards the end of the media firestorm. The second direction it can go is that they truly didn't want to attract attention to themselves and would rather suffer and be the subject of public scrutiny. The latter seems to be the more correct of the two, considering the family held on as long as they could to avoid going under the microscope in the court of public opinion. The second thing we need to examine is the involvement of the Warrens themselves. With having achieved their recent brush with fame through Amityville, they no doubt would have jumped at the chance to further this new reputation and bring light to one of America's truly great ghost stories. One of the things truly interesting with their involvement came from the comments made by Ed. He had come forward and stated that he had taken a great amount of evidence from the home during their investigation that was never made public. They would go on to say that it was provided to the church, but never was given to the media. With this evidence not being released to the public, or even for independent review, it can hardly be taken as genuine, only being able to go by word of mouth and promises made by Ed, or the one-sided account of a book that was written by those closest to the situation. With this, however, comes the other edge of the sword. There is nothing to say that what the Smurl family experienced was not a true haunting. The Smurl family endured hardship at the hands of a devastating hurricane in 1972. They relocated to a home that was close to where they had both grown up and had the love and support of their family and their religion. The phenomena was not experienced only by the Smurls themselves, but their in-laws as well. They were a family that had endured so many hard times and then were subject to unimaginable torture for 15 years. The only people that will know what truly happened in that home are the Smurls, the Warrens, and a handful of people close to the family. As for the remainder of us, we're only left to wonder. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of this week's story about the haunting of the Smurl family. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information on the podcast, please visit our show links in the link tree. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any of our weekly episodes. and follow our social media accounts as there are posts in there outside of the stories. If you liked the episode, please tell a friend about the Insidious Agenda podcast. If you would like to show your support for the podcast, donations can be made to our PayPal account in the link tree. Come back next week for the first edition of the Folklore Appendices, stories that deal with urban legends and folklore from around the world. Our first 2 stories will be of the weeping woman La Llorona and the terrifying entity that hides in the dark, known synonymously as the Boogeyman. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'll see you again next week.